We're going to start with Nico Schernbeck. He works with the Violence Prevention Network, which in my understanding is the biggest player in Germany, the biggest CSO in the field of PCVE. He's the co-head of the international department of VPN, where he leads the development of international projects, consultancies, capacity building. Before that, he worked with the OSCE chairs of Germany, Slovakia, and Albania, and he provided mediation and dialogue support for conflict parties in Mali, Myanmar, and South Sudan. So, Nico, we're looking forward to your obviously very international perspective, now working for a key German player. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing this event and for bringing together, I think, a really kind of insightful different angles. So I'll try to share my screen now, just a second. And go and take it right from there. I hope you can see it. Perfect, great. So yeah, actually, I think this was a really good scene setter from Ms. Sheo, so I will tap right into it. So the key questions that I would like to focus on, building on what we've also seen from the briefing paper that the Counter-Extremism Project provided, to really dig already into some key questions for this webinar. And that would be these three questions. So mainly looking at what are the challenges and lessons learned that we are aware of. As Alexander said, learning from mistakes in international practice, we always call it lessons learned. It's is one of the key aspects to identify commonalities, but also differences in programming, especially if we talk about upscaling programs against right-wing extremism. And then I will combine the two latter questions, sort of the question of how to effectively transfer good practices or inspiring approaches, how to transfer practitioner insights more effectively to strengthen PCVE action against right-wing extremism, with the question, how do you actually make a whole of society approach work? Because I think, and I'll not pretend that I have the final answer to this question. That would be obviously the million-dollar key, but maybe give one from our insights how to start doing that. Alexander already talked about organization, so I'll keep it brief. Maybe just to give you an idea that since 2001, since Violence Prevention Network started as a pilot project in prison, working with right-wing hate crime offenders, our programs have developed. So we actually had, you could say, a practice transfer from working with right-wing extremist offenders to then in the 2013, when really programs for working in the area of Islamist extremism have scaled up. So there was this kind of transfer. So obviously this question is really important for us as well, especially now as we're trying to also use the expertise that we have developed in our methodology in mutual casework with state partners to transfer that to international projects and support partners around the world. So yeah, I think the Counter-Extremism Project has made an important point here to look what can we learn from practices concretely from used by practitioners from different organizations in working on different fields of phenomena. And I will start right away with the challenges. I mean, this comes obviously is informed by our perspective as an NGO working in this field and supporting also partners, well, first working in Germany, but also supporting partners, for instance, in the MENA region in the EU. As Alexander mentioned, we are also supporting the Radicalization Awareness Network in its implementation, and then more lately also, especially in the Western Balkans. When we look at processes of programs and try to answer the question, how can we make our programs more effective? One of the key lessons learned is that really, like in Islamist extremism, the profiles, the needs and risks related to violent right-wing extremism and individuals and groups has really substantively changed over the past years. And I think I don't need to go into it. The study by CEP, especially on the transnational connection of groups and individuals, is a good resource here. But really just to make this a key point, is that the contrast between an ever-changing and ever-dynamic change of profiles versus programs that need to account for changing pathways of radicalization. And that's really a big challenge, because we've seen that, talking from our experiences, most of the programs that have been developed in disengagement projects, working with violent extremists, terrorist offenders in prison, be it Islamist extremists or right-wing extremists. And today we talk about the large groups that we try to reach and where we still try to find new answers that whose radicalization pathways have changed. There is loser affiliation versus a strong group identity. So more recently, I think this was also raised in the CEP study, especially in the right-wing scene, we see a loser affiliation of individuals, not necessarily being bound to one group, but being able to find social integration points with many different narratives, with many different groups. Biographical developments have changed. People from our caseworkers often talk about, the strong contrast to the German 1990s baseball bat years, where many programs were designed to respond to a very certain type of right-wing offender, towards today profiles like it was mentioned, the planned assassination of a German regional president, or the profile of Tamara Kay, who was involved in the attempted storm of the Reichstag, or for instance Robert Reeder, who was recently convicted as part of the attempted or the riot in the Capitol Hill. So what we see from these profiles is they're very loose affiliations. And another point is also talking about these different profiles. What we see is, and VPN, Violence Prevention Network, is one of the largest providers in this area of preventing and disengagement work. But the largest part of our clients are integrated into our programs through de-radicalization, disengagement programs. So we actually get in touch with most individuals that we want to work with when they have already committed violence and are already in the criminal justice system. So one big challenge in upscaling programs, and that counts also for Islamist extremism, is lack of access and limited entry points for intervention. So really the question, how can we reach broader spheres now of groups, of parts of society that are loosely connected to narratives of political extremism, that are more maybe on an ethno-nationalist, buy into ethno-nationalist narratives, or that have entry points coming via anti-vax, anti-government, anti-authority movements. So this is really a key question, and where we see at the moment a lot of shortcomings that also from our experience in upscaling programs that we are already working since over 20 years. I think another important point coming from the process level is really the actor level. And that's where it gets a bit more interesting, I think, also when we talk about promising practices. So one of the key challenges is really the wide range of stakeholders that are involved in PCVE work. This is something we know from working with Islamist extremism. And then on the contrast, the gaps in collaboration structures. So to give you maybe one example where this is especially evident from our perspective is the work in PCVE connected between the prison and exit continuum. So when we work with violent extremists or terrorist offenders, and in the case of violent right-wing offenders, this is for us about 800 cases since 2001. One of the key challenges has always been that for these types of offenders, they go through different cycles in prison, probation, post-release, and then after all of this, social reintegration. And all the actors that interface with these actors change. And there is a very loose and often insufficient connection of interventions. I think we've seen a lot of progress here in Germany. It really depends also on the lender, how this can be done in a multi-stakeholder structure or in multi-stakeholder partnerships between social and security workers. But I think this is clearly where a lot needs to be done. And something specific, again, these are just a few challenges. Of course, the point of the security sector and the role of the security sector in countering violent right-wing extremism. So one of the challenges we also see in international projects is initiating projects for awareness raising, prevention of violent right-wing extremism for actors from armed forces, security sector. So this is really, I think, especially with this phenomena, one of the bigger challenges in the Euro-Atlantic space, and something that has been also raised by CEP in the past. I think here it would be good to not only talk about prevention and awareness raising, but also about, in certain stages, disengagement of known cases. Resources and output, that would be my last point on the challenges, and then I'll come to one practice that I think we've designed over the last years that helped us to operationalize this. Reviewing gaps and blind spots is really a key point. I think transnationality in the stories and the biographies of Islamist extremists and violent right-wing extremists is something that has long been neglected in individual casework, also on the local level. This is a good case in point to better understand how groups are connected across borders and what this means for practitioners that work in different areas, how we connect among each other in our intervention programs and inform each other. Another really big blind spot that we've discovered over the past 5 years is the question of misogyny and group-focused enmity. So in a lot of profiles from right-wing offenders and Islamist extremists, we see a recurrence in misogynist violence. And this is something that I think systematically we only assess now since about 2 or 3 years, because this has been only from lessons learned in really seeing, okay, what are tipping points of violence? So reforming programs also in that sense makes sense, and entry points also for other age groups to identify if our programs with whom we try to reach through prevention or disengagement certain clients, are they really apt to fit gender or age specific dimensions? And then the last point is really key, because we talk a lot about kind of transfer of good practices, and that is important. But part of the story is also that right-wing extremism on the international agenda of donors is rather recent. So the biggest challenge is upscaling programs is, of course, investment. The upscaling of programs cannot go at the cost of a single case-by-case observation, and doing both at the same time requires a lot of good personnel. So if I talk to our caseworkers in Saxonia, for instance, and asked them, I did this also for this year, what's the biggest challenge that you see from your work? It's like, oh, getting staff, getting personnel, getting people that are ready to be hired for 1 year project periods, but at the same time trying to have all the knowledge that you need to have to work with high security cases. So I think this is really something where we need to think about a long-term political and operational investment. And this is already my last slide, and I'll try to really stay here on the surface on the question on how to operationalize the whole of society CVE work. So this is kind of trying to give the answer on what can we actually do to transfer lessons learned through a concrete methodology in casework, in prevention and intervention work. And much of it has to do is we need diverse resources. We need different actors, different insights to respond to changing challenges. And this is not lip service, but has concrete practical implications. So the 3 key components that we see in our methodology is strengthening through training, different types of tools, inclusion of civil society actors in multi-stakeholder work. In this case, of course, in the sphere of violent right-wing extremism, and bridging capacity gaps of first-line practitioners. And that can be from very different things, how to assess needs, how to conduct joint case conferences, or developing joint goals. And ultimately, with the goal to broaden the assessment of multi-stakeholder structures and to have a more effective and informed planning of interventions. What we've developed based on our case management process, in which we've tried to also do in EU-funded projects, like the EMMA project, or soon to start an I-Commit project, is to support multi-stakeholder actors across Europe in different cities through concise training across different stages of their cooperation. And I'll stay here on the surface. I'm really happy to answer questions here, but maybe just to say what the key point of this methodology is really to support practitioners with methods of social work, as opposed to risk assessment, which is also very important, tools like Vera2R and so on, to make a contribution to professionalize social interventions across the spectrum of prevention, and really to identify local and individual risks, and to go from social and biographical assessment to needs assessment, to bring different structures and different actors in, and then to really make informed multi-stakeholder decisions. This is, of course, very broad. I will happily answer any questions. And if you want to be more informed about this method, then you can also check out our toolbox here.
Perfect. Thank you, Nico. This was, I think, very helpful, addressing some of the major challenges, including the short-term financing that is still often taking place, and the challenges then of having getting enough people that are qualified to commit to a 1 or 2 year contract with absolutely no security after those 1 or 2 years. There's a slight change in some donors, but a major issue. Germany is trying to fix this with a new law that will provide, if it succeeds, long-term funding and long-term planning capacity for PCVE actors. And also, like, of course, at the end, the concrete toolkit that you suggested. So everybody who likes to really dive into the details can do this on the VPN webpage, or I guess reach out to you as well. So thank you for this. We actually have already a question, and that question was perfect in the way that it was first asked, and it was formulated in a way that it can be answered, and it was highlighted who is addressed. So please use the Q&A or F&A button, but we're not going to do this right now because we have so many excellent speakers still to come, and we're going to do all the Q&A at the end, but please feel free to just share your questions with us. So next speaker, Robert Orell, co-leader of the working group on rehabilitation at the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN. I guess everybody here probably knows Robert. He's been with the RAN for, I guess, 8 or 10 years. He has 20 years of experience in the field of supporting rehabilitation, reintegration of violent extremists. He was director of Exit Sweden for 10 years and was program director of Exit USA for 3 years. So he is one of the key go-to people, and that's why we're very happy, Robert, to have you. So please go ahead and share your insights and perspectives with us.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander, for this, and thank you, CEP, for arranging this excellent event on these important topics. I have slides to be shared. Please, can I help to have those up? I will talk about a few different perspectives. And the first is really to, when we look at violent extremist groups, and primarily right-wing extremists and violent Islamic extremism, if I can have full screen on next slide, please. We see a range of different perspectives that links up these groups when it comes to similarities and differences. When we look at the differences, there's the obvious difference of ideology. They really subscribe to very contrasting utopian ideologies where they don't really find common ground. They have different modus operandi, and there's different specificities with both of these different target groups. But when we look at similarities, and this comes especially from the practitioner perspectives of engaging with individuals involved in these groups. So as practitioners, as first-line practitioners, when we engage in conversations or when we engage in ways to create change or prevention, we see a range of similarities across the different ideological spectrums. And obviously, the mentality of the individuals, in the way that there's a very strong sense of superiority, there's a very strong the evaluation of everything that comes from the outside, try to have an argumentation with somebody in these groups, and you will notice that it is difficult to have ordinary type of conversations or debates where you discuss different type of topics. So we see really the similarities here, where we can learn from a range of different fields and also expanding to other ideological orientations. We also see the similarities in the invalidation of democracy as a system of governance, the lack of policies that are human rights compliant, and obviously laws created. So we see a range of similarities here. The validation of violence is probably one of the most obvious aspects when we look at these groups. They validate violence to create change from their ideological beliefs. The in-group and out-group dynamics are also quite prevalent and interesting to address here. We see individuals in these environments have a very strong sense of who is within the group and who is outside of the group, and how you create relations or how you treat people depending on their in-group, out-group identity or role. We see that a lot of the harm or the violence is carried out to specific groups outside of the in-group that you perceive as enemies, for example. We also see the worldview, which is usually very apocalyptic, dualistic, always in a search for purity, so to eliminate what seems to be impure within the group. And this is usually a constant type of dynamic in these environments, that once you kind of eliminated one type of a weakness, you constantly look for the next one, so that you always are in search for some type of perceived purity within the group and ideology. Of course, also the hierarchical structures, that's very clear. One thing that also has come up the last few years is obviously the pandemic and the reactions towards everything from lockdown to vaccinations, which interestingly have united a lot of different type of groups who all of a sudden can join forces in anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-mandate type of protest, where they can really put forward their perception of devaluating the legitimacy of the current political systems or leaders or parties or policies. So we see really the pandemic as an interesting phenomena in this sense of looking at the similarities. The hierarchical structures, etc. Next slide, please. So when we look at transferring lessons learned between different ideological orientations, or even between different contexts or national contexts, there's quite a lot of interesting experience of this. And obviously, within my work with Ron over the last decade, this has been one of the main focuses, to really share promising practices and help first-line practitioners in this type of work. But I wanted to just take a step back to get some perspectives of where we come from with this. Because if we look at the first exit program, the first NGO exit program that was set up in Norway, mid-late 1990s, at that point we didn't have the range of academic literature, the range of practice that we have today. And what they decided to look at was really learning from the US experience, the rich decades-long US experiences of cult disengagement? How do we learn from disengaging from other adjacent fields simply? And here the cult disengagement really focused on, it built on social psychology, psychotherapy, and a rich kind of funded in psychology and understanding of humans and interactions. We also see the transferability when it comes to, we actually just heard from Violence Prevention Network that started with focusing on right-wing extremism and then expanded to violent Islamic extremism. Myself, I've experienced working with right-wing extremism expanding to gang programs. Similarly with family support, where we also see synergies of working with a range of different phenomena separately, but also within groups. And what usually is the key aspect is to identify what type of practices there are. Most of the practices focus on an individual adapted approach, multidisciplinary teams, multi-agency cooperation, but really to dive down into the specificity of the individual, to understand what is it that the individual needs for leaving. Usually we would see two strong elements here: flexibility in approach and work. So what you approaches or interventions. So the flexibility to be able to adapt to the individual circumstances and perspective. Next slide, please. And then preventing stigmatization. So here, I would say policies are essential. So policies that are pro-reintegration, that support the ability to change and create systems that supports this type of process. We have policies that could either support cohesion or diversion. So really thinking of what type of policies do we have to address these type of questions or issues. And here also communication about the policies are essential. Why should we do different type of interventions? Why is it important to create rehabilitation, reintegration efforts? Why should we invest money in helping these individuals back? And obviously it's easy to go to say, well, what is the alternative, or what's the cost of not doing it, and looking at possible relapse, but really to formulate why is it and what is the purpose? Why do we do this? But also when we look at preventing stigmatization, to really involve and to listen to the receiving communities. So who is it that's going to work with these individuals? Who are the people who are going to be around? And how can we engage them in a way that we create understanding of the process of disengagement and rehabilitation, reintegration, to be able to create more of a co-created process and ownership, instead of saying, this is what we do and you have to accept it. So how can we instead cooperate and co-create and share? Some of the practices that we've been looking at within the RAN over the last couple of years is, for example, the approaches of restorative justice, or recently the post-conflict reconciliation. How do you address harm done and possible risks and especially needs of different communities through a lens of post-conflict reconciliation or restorative type of approaches? And obviously, communication comes back in once more. What type of communication do we have around these policies? There are some examples from countries who repatriated citizens from Syria and Iraq, where, for example, the children who came back were kind of concerned over how do we communicate about this, how do we work, and perhaps to find solutions on what to say and how to communicate within organizations or authorities. But one thing we have to remember as well is that the former activists, the former extremists, usually feel disconnected when they disengage from their previous environments. So how can we strengthen to create inclusion and connection for them? Next slide, please. And lastly, I address some of these points in a TED Talk, which is available on YouTube, where you can find out more about the similarities and how to work with disengagement and reintegration. So thank you very much, and that's